Today we're going over one of the most complex, intricate, and interesting concepts in competitive Pokemon: how we determine what makes a play good. And the how part of that sentence is significant because there is a distinction to be made. This video is not question, what makes a play good? Answer, X, Y, and Z. That's why this topic is so interesting. There is no objective correct answer. That's why players have been debating this as long as competitive Pokemon has been around. And that is the significance of this battle that you see on your screen right now. We're going to be using it as an example because as soon as a certain play was made in this game, then this very discussion erupted everywhere. Arguments have been raging ever since, and I thought this was a great opportunity to make a video about it because it is a perfect illustration of this concept. So I will say that objectively correct moves do exist, but those are at the end of the game, generally, when one player has it won and there is an objective correct path for them to follow that they cannot lose if they do. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about early game. And this is not restricted to metagames without team preview, by the way. But early game, where there are so many factors you have to take into account. Potential cases, movesets, partners, and whatnot. Just unknowns in general. And that is what... You have to make your decisions informed based on what you know. And that's where this debate comes in. Like, why was this play made with only this amount of information revealed? So, let's get into the battle really quickly. I think every single turn in most battles really can serve as a good example of, is this play good or not? But there are some cases where the definition goes from, fairly agreeable to, pretty nebulous, and we'll get there. So, we start off with Zapdos and Mence, and we'll go back over this game and cover, the other turns as well. But here we see that Linear is going to switch out of Zapdos into T-Tar and bring in and get Thunder Waved as Thomas stays in. And now he's going to switch out. He gets Pursuited, and that's also interesting. So here's the turn. So it's turn 2. Now, for those who aren't familiar with Advanced, then this next play might not seem outrageous, but it has sparked a lot of players' ire. Not just because it was made, but because it worked. So, Linear goes to Magneton, and Metagross uses Earthquake and KOs it. So, this Metagross is then revealed to be Choice Banded. We're going to skip around and just confirm that. So yeah, that Choice Band, that Mash goes off, no lefties first off, and then it does 28 to Swampert. So there's a lot to chew on here with this this turn. But so let's break it down. The idea of Skarmory and Magneton on one team, one of its biggest benefits is that Choice Band Metagross very often leads off with an explosion. And it does this because an offensive team against a bulkier team with Skarmory, the offensive team wants to end the game as soon as possible. So they cannot afford to take their time whittling Skarm down. Maybe I'll get a Meteor Mash attack boost, so I'll just attack it and hope for the best. No, usually they don't like to leave that up to chance, and they like to boom right away. That takes Skarm out and denies any spikes. Speeds up the pace of the game, makes it easier for them to win, for sure. So one of the strengths of Skarm Mag is that Magneton will often absorb this Choice Band boom for Skarmory. And Magneton is a lot less valuable against an offensive team than Skarmory is. So this is absolutely a positive trade, especially when most teams with Choice Band meta rely on it blowing up Skarmory in order to not get overwhelmed by spikes as they're trying to break through the opposing defensive core. So this is the strength of Skarm Mag. And the reason this works is because if you have a Choice Band Metagross, and Choice Band Metagross has to fear Skarmory above all else. And therefore, even if you're not exploding, then you're meteor mashing. You're trying to wear down the Skarmory, right? So that is why Magneton is such a good initial switch. If there's a Choice Band mash, dead. The Metagross is dead. And if the Choice Band explosion goes off, then great. That's a perfect 1-for-1 because Skarmory is still alive. And Choice Band Metagross doesn't pair with Magneton because their niches kind of overlap, and you generally don't need Choice Band's power for anything else. Choice Band's power nowadays is really just used for breaking through a Skarm. So that's the context. So now you see why if you have a Magneton and a Skarmory, then if you're facing this unknown Metagross set, then you can scout with your Magneton, because the biggest threat is that what Magneton also does is if this Metagross double switches to Magneton, then the Mags will trap each other, and then Linear's Mag will be able to do something, usually T-Wave and HP Fire, to Tama's Mag, and then Linear's Skarm will be in the clear. So the reason why you will generally why this generally works is because if it's not Choice Band, then it's not threatening to OHKO Skarm with Boom, so you can feel that set out, and then you can pivot into Skarm on the EQ, and then you are good to go, and you can take the game from there. If you fear a Magneton, you can double switch out, but you will know that you are not losing your Skarm for nothing. That's the worst case scenario. So generally, Mag plus Skarm works, right? So we know that, and we know that Metagross is obligated to hit Skarm as quickly as possible, as hard as possible, as quickly as possible. That is the whole key, because otherwise Skarm is the biggest threat to Metagross. If you let, in offensive teams in general, if you let Skarm spike all over you, then you are cooked. That is why offense needs to hit really hard and fast, or they're just going to lose. So Skarmory and Magneton is not an obligatory Skarmory partner, far from it. So you can't just play around the Skarm Mag all the time. This actually is kind of an inconsistency with advanced offense in general, but that's a topic for... If you want more on that, then I recommend looking at my video on why mixed offense tends to not be so good in current advance. Anyway, so we know that Metagross is obligated to take down the Skarm as quickly as possible, or at least hit it as hard as possible, to let the rest of his offense really go off, and be threatening, and not get chipped away at so easily. Not chipped away at for free is the whole idea. So you have to respect Skarm above all else. So then when Magneton comes in and the Earthquake goes off, then this sparks the question that is at the heart of this debate. If it worked, is it a good move? So now, of course, there's a lot of nuance to consider in these situations. One thing that Choice Band Metagross sometimes runs is Brick Break, specifically for Skarm and Mag. But if you're fearing Brick Break, then you may as well just cut your losses with... You can't play too scared of every possibility, is the basic gist. And it is still a rare choice. Most players prefer Rock Slide, because Zapdos is a major threat. So in essence, you cannot be so terrified of every possibility that you just make bad moves. And otherwise, you're going to lose games that you would otherwise be winning because you were too tentative. So the Metagross EQs, and of course now we think, okay, well, what if he Choice Band EQ'd into Skarmory? Well, that's where the new part of the nuance comes in. If the EQ goes off, then Linear's probably thinking, oh, there's probably a Magneton, because no way would a Choice Band Metagross Earthquake there. So it's probably not C. And this is where the information factor comes into play. So yeah, no way would a Choice Band... the EQ makes sense, but if it's not a Choice Band Metagross, so there's a Mag, so... even then, generally, even regular meta will... Or non-Choice Band meta will still mash, or, Hidden Power or something, to, try and knock Skarmory into... Well, Hidden Power is a bad example if there's a Mag with it, because that won't change anything. It's HP Grass with Mag, HP Fire without. So basically, they're going to try to mash if that's their best move to hit a Skarm switch, to make sure it's in Magneton range. So, but Earthquake is just generally rare. Because, again, if you're not a Choice Band Metagross, you don't need to EQ Magneton on the switch. It would be better to just cover the biggest threat, Skarm. So this is where the whole debate stems from. It's like, yeah, that was an incredibly risky move, because if Skarm comes in on the EQ, then, I mean, yeah, the game might be over if Linear decides to not scout for Mag, or if he decides to, if he decides to, look, I'm going to live this and Mag and roar it out, and then I'll be fine with my one spike. I mean, if he got nothing for that spike, like he would have with his team, then he was very likely boned, because if you watch the entire game, there's a crit focus punch on the Skarm, and if you watch the entire game, then this was incredibly close, even with that move where he got the mag for free. So it ended up with a double flinch from DD Tar with the HP Grass, and then Jirachi finished the game off. So put it this way, now that we know Tama doesn't have, again, information or lack thereof is what makes these debates so tough, because on the surface level, most players are saying, look, that was not a good EQ because just because it worked. Because if you let Skarm in for free and it spikes, then you're doomed. If Linear decides, look, I'm just going to play it safe and I'm going to go Skarm, and you give up the free spikes for absolutely nothing, and your offensive team is falling behind, and and you make it a lot easier. You just sped up your loss by a lot by going against what these teams need in order to succeed, i.e. the denying of Skarmory spikes. So, and and what I was saying when I was joining one of these debates was, if you are so afraid of Magneton, trapping you, then you just run Brick Break, because Brick Break hits Skarmory just as hard as Meteor Mash, and also guards you against a potential Mag Switch, so you can potentially get a really nice 2-for-1 there. So that's something to consider, rather than making that potentially game-losing move, because I don't know if I would go so far as to say the game ends right there. Some players are, but I mean, it's certainly a significant setback when these kinds of teams, these offensive teams, tend to struggle against spike stuff in general, and that just speeds up. It accelerates the pace at which they risk just running out of steam. So now another part of the information debate is, well, how can you ascertain that there is a Skarm or there is a Magneton alongside the Skarm just based off the first two Pokemon? How can you ascertain that the Metagross is Choice Band? And again, you can. There's a lot to... I mean, now we can further explore this concept just off the first turn, because a lot of players, especially in a best-of-one situation like this, then they will like to look at each other's tendencies in certain matchups and try to exploit that. So Tama figures, alright, he's not going to risk his Ments, so I'm going to stay in with Zapdos. A lot of players will not risk their Zapdos to a Choice Band Rock Slide, and if they do keep their Zapdos in, it's likely because it's fast with HP Ice, so, and they would use it in that scenario. But a lot of players would just switch out, so the fact he stayed in T-Wave meant, look, that's another debate. Is that a good move? It worked. He T-Waved the T-Tar. Or he didn't get punished for it, at least, because the T-Wave on T-Tar was fairly inconsequential. So, these kinds of debates... I mean, some people were calling for Ments to stay in on Zapdos. And that, I think, is an example of a not good move. I mean, that's the kind of case where, if it worked out, then it would be fine. Like, if the Zapdos T-Bolts and the Ments just KOs it with Rock Slide, it worked out, so it's fine. But there's so much at risk there. And a lot of it depends on your team, and that's why it's so difficult to make such a definitive statement on how a play. Let me try and put this in a normal person phrase. It's hard to make a clear statement on how good a play is in that moment, because we don't know the rest of the team. We don't know if Linear needs to risk the Ments against Zapdos, like if his team is terrified of Zapdos for some reason. Or we don't know. I mean, we can potentially get something out of this exchange, like, oh, Tama doesn't like switching into Linear's Ments because he's got an offensive team, and that's true. His Zapdos is his best Ments check, and he can't afford to switch around it too much. Or he just said, look, he's not going to risk it, and I want to get a T-Wave off. So, whether that's a good or bad play, again, this is where it gets more nebulous, because you don't know enough about the other player's team at this point, and it's only really once the game ends that you can go back and say, okay, this was a good or bad move based on X, Y, Z. Now, Mixed Ments is pretty much never going to stay in on Zapdos, and CB Ments, if it stays in, is going to slide. So you could definitely say, well, you can just switch to your Metagross maybe, and if they go to a special wall like Blissey or Snorlax or even T-Tar, then your Metagross is great against that, and if they go for the CB Rock Slide, then you cover that chance as well. So the hard switch from Zapdos to Metagross against Ments turn 1, I think most would consider that a good move because it covers all the realistic possibilities. And then, of course, you could have a fantasy scenario where Ments leads off against Zapdos and uses Fire Blast, and it would completely cook the Metagross. And then you would have another example of, well, it worked, but was it a good move? And the answer in that case, I think, would be a firm no. It was not a good move. It was, as soon as you start getting into opponent tendencies, then you stop considering the state of the game as a whole. And, I mean, there's always going to be some element of reading your opponent, of course. But generally you try to do that throughout the game, and you don't try to risk the game on a hunch, generally, because most top players say, look, I can outplay this guy, and I'm not going to risk my chance of outplaying them by, because of a guess. So in that theoretical scenario where let's say Linear noticed Tama switches Zap out of Ments all the time and goes to a Metagross or a Skarmory, and he goes, alright, I'm going to lead off with Ments, I'm going to Fire Blast in the first turn. Would that be a good move? Again, this is why I personally don't think so. A lot of other players would say, if it works, it's a good move. And that's why this whole debate is so tricky. Some players will ardently defend plays like that in the right scenario. I agree, sometimes you have to be flexible, you can't always be super safe and predictable, but I think there's line to be drawn, and that's why this discussion is so interesting. So, anyway, the T-Wave goes off against the Tar. You could also say, oh, if Ments stays in, he can T-Wave, and ruining Ments is good for pretty much his whole team if he's threatened by it. So now here comes the Tar against the Zapdos. Now this is also an interesting move. This pursuit on the second turn. One of Zapdos' most common moves on offense is Baton Pass, and you would think, oh, well, why would you pursuit if Zapdos Baton Passes all the time? Because that does nothing, and you just dink your switch in barely. So you could say, oh, this wasn't a good move. Why would that be done? And then you realize Ments intimidated the Zapdos, and if he's switching to a physical attacker, then he doesn't want to pass that -1. So the pursuit there was a good move. And again, it's hard to consider all these factors, especially when you're in the game itself. So I think when you're, obviously some plays are bad as soon as you see them, like leaving, I don't know, Fortress in on a lead, Salamence, and I mean, even then you could say, oh, well, he never runs Mixed Ments, so I'm going to stay with my Fortress, and some would say, if it works, it works. Of course, the downside is, generally a decent metric to look at is, how stupid are you going to look if this doesn't work? Because there are some plays that don't work, but no one's going to blame you for making them. If you go to Swampert to counter T-Tar and you get HP Grass on the switch, no one reasonable, I mean, obviously there are nuanced situations, of course, where you have to take more into account, but, just as a general example, if you go to Swampert and you get HP Grass on a T-Tar, no one's going to go, oh, you stupid idiot, what are you doing switching Swampert into T-Tar? No, you cannot be blamed for that. But there are some moves like the theoretical Men's Fire Blasting, the Meta Switch thing, or, in this Tama example, like, if Tama Choice Band EQ'd into Skarm, then he would look foolish, and he would look like he just, threw the whole game away by not doing what Choice Band Meta is supposed to do. So, yeah, that's why this debate is so interesting. I know I've said that a bunch, but I just have to hammer it home, because a lot people like to argue this stuff all the time, especially because there are some players who are known for, playing it safe always, and then there are some players who, are always doing this, I'm going to risk the game on the first turn kind of thing, and there are some players who mix it up, and they're the most dangerous, because you never know what they're going to do, or with significantly less certainty, and that's what makes them threatening. Because like someone like Blunder is a great example, because usually he won't risk the entire game on a single turn, but sometimes he just might, and you end up looking dumb, and then of course it has just as much chance of making him look dumb, and that's where the whole thing is. People will go, oh, that was a dumb play he made, and it just happened to work, or it was a dumb play he made and he shouldn't have made it, and that's why he lost. But if it had worked out, then it would have been pretty good for him. So, a lot of players tend to err on the side of, I'm going to control what I can and not risk, losing the game on the spot if I don't have to. And, some players try to take advantage of that mindset. But in doing so, they risk the game for themselves. And that's why I'm going to say it once again, this debate is so, intricate. There are so many things that we couldn't possibly cover in this video without, making it a little mini-series. And I can't do that without funding. So, like people were saying, oh, well, you have to consider that the metagross could be mixed, and, that's the whole idea is, you can't switch Skarm into a potential mixed gross, and, look, you have to switch in Skarm at some point. And, Magneton against a mixed offense team like this, if that's a mixed meta, then, you're not going to have much use for it anyway. You'll still live. You'll have it as death fodder later. That's fine. You can absorb a boom with it. And then you'll still have your Skarm. You'll get down your spike and you'll be fine. You're playing around... Generally, you play around the biggest threat your opponent has. And in this situation, that biggest threat is the boom. That eliminates Skarm, just deletes it from the game, and with it, any chance of spikes, which are a major source of pressure for Linear's team. So... And that's why, he just went against the grain. So let's say, the Skarm comes in. Linear was saying, I probably don't stay in if Skarm comes in on, what was he say? Linear says, I don't stay in if, he might not have stayed in if he feared it was, if he goes to Skarm and if he goes to Skarm on an EQ, he probably doesn't stay in for fear of Magneton, which is valid. But, in that case... do you fear Magneton so much that you go to Ments and then get forced out by Zapdos again, and then, you potentially lose an opportunity to get a crucial spike up and get a big advantage? Or do you double switch to your Ments, which also takes a potential cheeky second Earthquake or an HP Fire or Thunder Punch or something, and also scares out a Magneton switch? That's why, these plays are so tough to make. And again, a lot of players like to put a lot of stock in their opponent's usage stats, and what they've scouted from them, the tendencies they've gleaned from watching their replays. So it's tough, but in a game of limited information, then you generally try to control what you can, and that's why this play was just was mind-blowing. Personally, I don't agree with this tactic for a reason I already mentioned. If you're so terrified of Magneton, then you Brick Break on your CB meta. You don't risk giving Skarm completely free entry and then getting spiked on and losing really hard, in all likelihood. So, that's my stance on it. But, others were saying, look, it worked, and that's all that matters. And, of course, if a play works, then who are you to turn your nose up at it? But the question is, do those plays work consistently? And, oftentimes, if you're going to lead off with Earthquake like this and give Skarm completely free switch-ins, then no, that's usually not going to work. And some players say, best of one, all I need is that one-off surprise and it works. Whether it's an unexpected moveset or Pokemon or even a play. So, That's why it's so bizarre. And now we can't afford to. Well, we're not going to get into a full-scale battle analysis. So, but we know in retrospect. Oh, I wanted to say, maybe, you could say that with regards to limited information, Tama could say, look, I'm going to EQ into the Skarm, and he's going to think, no way he EQs into Skarm without Mag. Therefore, he's going to switch out and scout for the Mag, and therefore he's not going to get up spikes. I mean, I don't agree with that thought process, but you could make that argument theoretically. So, yeah. Especially for a number of reasons. Like, what if the Skarm is just, HP ground, and it doesn't care if Mag switches in? It's a lot of... As soon as you start relying more on your opponent's tendencies, instead of focusing on what you yourself can control, that's when you start introducing uncertainty into the game, and when you can't rely on your own moves as reliably, then that's a bad feeling. I can't stand it personally. So I think it's better to just focus on yourself rather than, my opponent's totally going to think this certain way, because as much as you might think it would be totally logical for my opponent to think this way, sometimes they just don't. And they will make a play that you would... I mean, a lot of people do this. I've seen this so many times. Like, oh, I lost because my opponent made plays that were too stupid for me to beat. And, yeah, to some extent, everyone's lost on ladder because they played some idiot who kept, fortressing on Salamence and got fired, and you didn't Fire Blast when you should have. But, there is a certain degree of skill in controlling that. Like, if their plays are so stupid, then you can just play straight forward and, win. I mean, as flashy as those plays look, like, oh, I totally stayed in on the 4E, and I got on the Mence with my 4E, and I got my spike up, and, it was awesome. They can just backfire on you if your opponent decides to play it straight, which a lot of the time people tend to do. So, something else to consider. Anyway, I wanted to mention another play or two. Yeah, I thought this was a relative waste of a Hydro, because, I guess it reveals the Skarm spread if it comes in. I was going to say because if it's like an impish Skarm, then Hydro will outdamage the Wish, so maybe not. But I was going to say maybe he could have Earthquaked to outdamage the Wish a little on Blissey. Barely. It probably didn't make much of a difference. But yeah, so there's anyway, the focus, that also really bit for Linear, because he gets, who knows if he was toxic, or getting another layer of spikes, or, a phase off would have been useful, because he's really playing from behind because of that turn. Yeah, best of one is such a volatile environment sometimes, it's crazy. Anyway. What was the move? Zapdos... Okay, this is the move, yeah. So Tama makes a good move saying, look, I'm not going to risk this T-Tar can live in a Hydro Pump and HP Grass me back, and Swampert is clearly a huge threat, so I'm not going to risk it. I'm going to go to my Zapdos. That I agree with. And you could even say, look, with the Blissey, then Zapdos is not going to be very valuable. But here's why I think it could be viewed as not a great move. And the subsequent move as well, where Zapdos stays in, T-Bolts, and, goes down, and then Meta comes in. So here's why I don't think those two moves were great. And this is an example of it being a more clear-cut case. I mean, a lot of those other moves, there's a level of, oh yeah, well, you could make the argument. And that's what I mean. Or rather, that's what I meant earlier. Like, some plays, no one can blame you for, even if you disagree with them, you can say, I understand why that play was made. Even if I personally wouldn't have made it, it's hard to disagree with it, or hard to call it objectively wrong. Now, I'm not saying that, this play with Metagross was objectively wrong, but if you look at everything here, then you could say, look, why does Zapdos need to come in here at all if you're expecting the HP Grass? And even if the Zapdos is in on the HP Grass, it's very unlikely that, first of all, with the Magneton, that it's incredibly unlikely that the T-Tar, the Pursuit T-Tar, has Fire Blast. So even if you're trying to avoid, and it almost has to have Ice Beam, specifically because it was the switch into lead Zapdos, and he cannot just give up a free trap to Doug Trio on the first or second turn. So, or counter or something. But it's not going to be packing Fire Blast because that's going to be a waste of a slot. So that is why you could say, look, Meta's going to be a better move here, and he's not going to, even if he has Fire Blast, he's almost certainly not going to be use it while paralyzed against the Swampert that's trucking through his whole team. And yeah, so the Zapdos I understand, just to really make sure, but he can't afford to get fancy against that Zapdos and just fall even further behind. So I think on one of those turns, Metagross definitely should have come in, and I think that's more an example of this play was better. So we can see that. Yes, sometimes you can say the so-and-so play might have worked or might not have worked, but there are good arguments for both sides. But this, I think, is more a case of where some moves are simply better than others. So then you can. I mean, you can do this for a lot of turns. You could say, oh, well, you should just Earthquake here because this last slot is obviously the dedicated Rock Resist, and Salamence is not switching into the banned, or I guess he doesn't know it's banned. Actually, with no Magneton and the Metagross not having lefties, then the odds go up significantly. So you could definitely make an argument, yeah, that should be a banded Earthquake to smack that Rock Resist, whether it's Swampert or even better, Metagross. I guess if you're afraid of Flygon, then... See, that's what I mean. There's no correct answer. You could say, oh, well, that could have been a Flygon in the last slot there. And you could say, okay, fair enough. Maybe Mash was the safe play. But you could also say, oh, well, Swampert does this, that. It's not weak to Ice and Water. And you could say, okay, well, it could also be Metagross, so should be Mash, should be EQ. But there's debate for it, is my overall point. So, now here comes the... Mence, I think that's an example of a good move because that Pert is not exactly looking to spam Ice Beam here. It's not free against such a banded Mence, or against a banded Metagross. So anyway, now the meta comes back in on the banded hit. Nice move from Linear, going for Brick Break, trying to catch a Rock Resist of some sort. If it caught a T-Tar trying to pivot in, that would have been really helpful. Like a Pursuit Tar, because Pursuit Tar is common on these kinds of offenses to limit the damage Will-O-Wisp Gengar does, and if it comes in on a Rock Slide and pursuits Metagross, or pursuits Mence, then that's really risky. Or that's really, really, goodbye. So, you could argue that he could have Earthquake there because it would have hit Mence, or it would have hit a T-Tar and Metagross. Again, so... That's what I'm saying more. This play was okay, could have been better, but it's hard to call it like a bad play and so on. And now Tama goes for the boom. And again, there's so much... I probably shouldn't break down the entire rest of the game, but you could say, look, why wasn't it just another Mash or another Earthquake? Or why did it have to be boom? And then you could say, well, if Perk comes in on a Mash, then he struggles to switch into it safely. And so, again, this is not a clear-cut case of, oh, this move should have been this, that, the other thing. This is a case of, okay, I understand it, and, good play on Linear's end by managing to absorb that boom with T-Tar. I read that situation nicely. So, yeah. Now, so now we have the T-Tar, which, I mean, he doesn't really have better moves, which I think this is more a case of how this kind of team tends to struggle with these kinds of offensive teams tend to struggle with these kinds of bulky teams, even when things go their way early on. It's similar to when Magneton mags a Skarm early on, and they still struggle to break through. So, yeah, I guess the double flinch, which, sucks a lot, of course, and then, you just can't finish that one off, even with the slide miss. So, yeah, that was pretty straightforward. But before, there was a lot of debate for those turns. So I'm interested to hear your guys' thoughts. There have been a lot of debates. Come hang out on Discord. I managed to get that plug in there, didn't I? About if that was a good move or not. The EQ into the Magneton. I'll be participating in it further, I'm sure, and it's going to be a common thing. So I hope to see the comment sections going all in on it. So, yeah, thanks. I think that's all. Our Discord link in the description. So thank you guys so much for watching. Nicely done to both players, of course. They're both among the best advanced players ever. So just watch them both play as a treat. And yeah, it was an interesting game, and certainly set off some interesting discourse. So thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you got something from it, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts, and I'll catch you next time.